Well, I'm very happy to say I'm back with Duncan Clarke, who I last spoke to after he'd published his, what I think, seminal work on Cecil Rhodes, titled Rhodes' Ghost. Duncan, welcome. Good to see you again.
Good morning, Hans, and great to see you, and keep up with your series on fighting men of Rhodesia, which is a formidable oral history. I think will stay on the record for a long, long time.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. I appreciate it. You know, I say to people, it wasn't my idea, and I'm really quite surprised by how much interest those talks have generated. It really has worked out very nicely in a way, and given a lot of guys a chance to tell their stories that otherwise would probably have been lost to history.
Yes, correct. Yes.
Duncan, I'm pleased to say that the book arrived today. I've got it here.
Good timing.
Fantastic. And you know, I spoke at a book book launch for Peter Badcock last week on Friday. He's got produced this book, A War Artist's Diary, and we had a bit of a get together in Cape Town. And I said to people there, what I'm going to say to you now, I really mean this. And I'm not just saying it flippantly, but you operate on a different level intellectually to the rest of us. Your command of the English language just blows my mind. It reminds me of how poor my grasp of the language is. And the historical detail you've gone into is just quite incredible. And I know not everybody reads books, but anybody who's interested in Rhodesian history, I think needs to doff their cap to what you've done, because I know that this isn't a money-making endeavor, and just incredible how much work must have gone into it. How you produce all this literature in so short a space of time is also something that fascinates me. And again, I can't begin to compete in the same league as you. But yeah, thanks again. And Duncan, I just want to kick off by starting off with just tell us your background again, and just a bit of background to the book, and who's making it available. I know we at Ex Modibus Media are getting some stock next week, so we'll be able to. But just tell us again a bit about yourself and the background to the book.
Thanks, Hannes. And just to correct you, I struggled through special English as well, and and I don't see myself as any author of note. However, to come to your question, I born in Salisbury in 1948. My father had been born in Gwello, 1909. His father had arrived in 1896 in Bulawayo. Now, the old man spent 43 years in government. His father, my grandfather, 38. I think if I counted up, I spent about 6 or 7 weeks in the PWD during a university vacation, and 4 weeks in the Salisbury municipality collecting pennies from the parking meters in the day. So my extent of government service is minimal. So yes, I've been a third generation born Rhodesian, and all of our family are similar in one form or generation or another. They're 4 buried in different layers in the soil, 3 walking the ground right now. And I was brought up in Salisbury, half the time sort of between there and Inyanga, where the old man had a small farm after he retired. I went to school in St. George's College, then to Rhodes University afterwards to take economics. I came home 1969 to teach economics at the university in Salisbury. And in between, I did 2 sojourns overseas in St. Andrews, following up graduate studies in economics, to come home in 75. And then subsequently, I was asked to come to the university in Natal to set up an Institute of Economics there for a short while, and I later left to Geneva, where I stayed 10 years. And there I fell into, well, I discovered oil, as it were, and in 1978, 79, and in the sense that I fell into the worldwide oil industry. So I've been nomadic pretty much across 6 continents, about 127 countries at last count, and 47 in Africa. And I've met Rhodesians everywhere. You know, there's a phrase, they're scatterlings, and that's very, very true. After Rhodes Ghost, I was looking to find a bookend to the story about the foundations of the country, which Rhodes Ghost attempts to treat with. And so I thought about the Last Rhodesians, and this is the book that you have in your hand there. The first one was, 4 or 5 years in the writing, this last one, 2.5 or so, but all built on a large years and decades of writing, collecting documents, thinking, and of course, scribbling, and research involving travel and sort of time in libraries and hunt for literature, etc. The book is available in South Africa in the first edition that you have through Protea Books and Ex Montibus Media, your website, and it's on Amazon worldwide. So that's pretty much the background to the book and the story of how I got to write it.
Okay. Duncan, you're addressing a very, what I think, very difficult question, trying to identify and explain the Rhodesian culture. Just tell us how you saw that developing.
Well, I think the culture came out of the identities formed from the very early times, and its roots were really pre-Rhodesian, pre-1890. If you think about Frederick Courtenay Selous, for instance, the subsequent pioneers that translated over from Old into what then became Mashonaland, and then joined with Manicaland and Matabeleland, Rhodesia, etc., and onwards. These settlers sought a new pathway, if you wish, and they created this identity of the Rhodesians. This is well explained in very early text literature and books. For instance, a famous one by Gertrude Page in the very early 90s, 1890s, 1900s, called The Rhodesians. And she was like the Kipling of Rhodesia, and she sold millions of books, actually. It's quite extraordinary, the story. The country was identified itself on the maps of the world as a Westphalian state, just like the states in Europe. You would see it marked down as no longer Monomotapa, the old image that was given in the days of the Portuguese and then later Zambezia, but defined by boundaries called Rhodesia. These are the very same boundaries that prevail today for Zimbabwe, of course. And its social origins of the cultures arose out of hardship, I believe. It was a very tough time for the first pioneers in Fort Salisbury. There were torrential rains, exceptional rains, never seen before or since. There was pestilence, it was cut off. Then there was the Ndebele War, the 2 rebellions, subsequently the Boer War. And there were Rhodesian identities shaped through some form of relationship and often hostile to the company state. Subsequently, World War I, World War II, the regiments flew, or if you like, acted under the name of the Rhodesian Army and regiments. There was the big break in 1923 when Rhodesia got its self-independence. Then there was the federal period where it was known as Southern Rhodesia, part of the Federation. And of course, UDI really created the first formative dissociation worldwide from anything linked before. So there are these early generations, I call them pre-Rhodesians, what I call the original Rhodesians, the born Rhodesians, the acculturated Rhodesians, the one that came and adopted and adapted to the culture, and including a lot of migrants from all sorts of parts of the world. And you still have them there today. They carried on after independence for Zimbabwe and so on. And this culture was evolutive. It's identified in language. It's, very much seen in phonetics and, if you like, allegiances in terms of its accent. An accent that's not very loved everywhere, as you probably encountered. Always, it's not South African, it's not British. And there's a big divide on the Limpopo between the deep south, or down south, as we used to call it always, and still do, and what is Rhodesia and Zimbabwe. And these divides cross all cultures in the country. So there are many, many forms of cultural imprints in the Rhodesian culture. Afrikaners obviously came to an apex of about 12% in the day. Many fewer now, of course. The Irish were there from the beginning. and a smorgasbord of European sources, Italians, and Jewish, and Greek, Polish, and migrants from all parts of different parts of the world. So really, it's a kind of smorgasbord, a consolidation in cultures and history that has shaped the origins of the identity in the country.
Duncan, in the book, there's an amusing quote by Dennis Tavares, who was an RAF MP, if I remember correctly, where he says, Rhodesian born, Rhodesian bred, thick in the arm, thick in the head.
Correct. Yeah, well, you know, we all had our limits and flaws, and it was never a perfect claim in culture that it was, you know, somehow pristine. The Rhodesians, however, knew who they were. Dennis Tavares, by the way, was the local MP in Belvedere where I lived. So I used to go to his store very often when I was a lightie. In effect, from the very beginning, you know, Rhodes established a country that was a form of mini empire. It was a power that sat across the old clans and patriarchies in the Indibellian Shona cultures. And then it brought in different parts and streams of peoples to form the Rhodesian culture, which was in effect, in terms of its cultural character, really multi-ethnic. If you include here, as was included often in various cases with clear differentiations, the coloureds who came from the south, from the Cape. Then there were many more local born, naturally. So it became a polyglot community. And then even Indians that came very, very early on, who were mixed between the Hindu, the Muslim, and there was a branch also of Muslim Africans coming in from Iceland, from northern Mozambique, etc. And all those coalesced in various cultural overlays and behaviors and common and sometimes commercial and opposed interests. And you saw this shift over time. The Rhodesians carried on. And after 1980, of course, at independence, there were outflows. There was the serial exoduses of Rhodesians, both during the war, after the war, in Zimbabwe, subsequently, and these have been continuing over 40 to 50 years. And this shaped what has been called in partly in jest, partly not, the when we world. You have many different identities included here. People who self-identify as Rhodesian or Rhodes. Some have come up with hybrid identities, white, Ndebele, white African, white Shona even. I even have a cousin who says he was a white Shona. His grandfather came in 1896. And the cultural imprints can be seen all over. You will find them in Rhodesian houses, in houses of people still there in Harare and Bulawayo and elsewhere. You'd see it articulated in art and poetry, various artifacts. It's shaped by the language and lingo, the slang that was used. And of course, it was shaped by sport. It's seen in the flags, various forms of flags. The end one, of course, the green and white. The Zimbabwe flag didn't really catch on, of course, and quite seriously different to the current Zimbabwe flag, which is symbolized with the red star and has associations with the Maoist world. And of course, the Rhodesians celebrated days, Pioneer Day, etc., etc., roads and founders, or rogues and bounders, whatever kind of view you took of it. And it had a nationalism. There was a Rhodesian nationalism. Unofficially, you would see this culture expressed in meritocracy, which was one of the defining features of the Rhodesian world. And of course, in not only the sort of conventional music of national anthems, but in the ballads, people like John Edmund, Clem Follett, many others. And notably in all the different literature that the Rhodesians wrote and was written about them. A lot of it, an enormous amount of literature, defines this culture quite clearly.
Duncan, I just want to just toss something in there. Still, something I can't quite get my head around is why was it that these disparate ethnic groups and racial groups somehow seem to coalesce so quickly? What was the catalyst that made people adopt a national identity as quickly as they did? Because it seems to have happened unusually quickly in Rhodesia. Can you put your finger on that?
I'm not sure it was instantaneous. It wasn't overnight, but there were all the strands coming together from the Pioneer Day, the adversity, as I've mentioned, in different forms, the coalescence during a series of wars, Rhodesians, in one form or another, in the 90-year period of the state from 1890 to 1980, have been at war for 30-some years, 35 years, in one form or another, on one or another global battlefield, including the last 16 from 1964 at home and in the periphery around the countries in Central Africa, as you know. And of course, this identity shaped and formed, and I suppose underneath it was commonality.
Adversity bringing people together.
It did that, but there was also common interest in economic relationships. And of course, this also spread outside the, if you like, strictly Rhodesian culture and cross-pollinated with African interests and coloureds and Indians and others. So it wasn't an exclusive identity. By contrast, a lot of the literature you see written by mostly foreigners and people who are ill-informed, I think, on the history, will often use what I see as a surface phenomenon and simply describe that world as black and white. That's really a kind of razor-thin understanding of the history and the culture.
Duncan, talking about adversity, and you as an economist are probably better placed than most to talk about this, but the country was under sanctions for 15 years, I think. How effective were they? And just tell us about your take on the whole sanctions story.
Well, I think you have to realize that the preparations for UDI were taken before 11 November 1965. The RF at the time, Smith, the cabinet, the government, the various functionaries in the government, in the parastatals, in a number of state institutions, took preparatory measures. One of the notable ones, of course, was getting banknotes printed by the Reserve Bank under Noel Bruce at the time. And they set up some kind of networks and preliminary strategies and thoughts about what would happen. Effectively, sanctions came down like an iron curtain, initially from the British, and then in 1966, mandatory United Nations sanctions. There were very few exit paths. South Africa, what was then Portuguese East Africa, Portugal, Switzerland were the only ones really available in those days. And there was also developed, of course, the sanctions-busting, various networks. There were big difficulties with oil, getting crude in from Beira to the landings and pipeline up to Faruka. There was rationing, quite strict, very strict indeed. And there were product supplies coming from South Africa. There were deals made with George Jardim and others for product trading and supply, etc. And the Rhodesians adapted in consumption. You'll recall the use of old cars, the conservation mentality, and the introduction very early on of ethanol into fuel supply. Up to 20% of all product was ethanol. And you went to the petrol station and you bought blend. You didn't buy BP, Shell, etc., etc. That was out. There was no branding involved anymore. So the covert sanctions busting also stretched to various parts of the world, to Gabon, to Oman, to the Comoros, across Africa, Europe, and elsewhere. And the impacts initially were not severe. They were accommodated. In fact, the economy grew quite significantly for the first 10 years, 65 to 75. But then the cumulative impact started to come through. And you could see this happening if you looked at the national accounts, the allocations in the budget, and the growth rates, in what was happening, particularly in the rural areas and the tribal trust lands and so on. So the economic war did come to play a significant part from, I would say, 75-6 onwards. And that's where I think you get a turning point in the history and saga of Rhodesia at the time. Pronounced also by other political events, Smith's meeting with Kissinger and Forster, and difficulties later with armaments and material and so on. But underlying this was the economic drama, I reckon, that weakened the state. It had to spend more on defense. It was less able to do anything in the economic sphere easily. And it had to abandon, and I think it was abandoned earlier, more like 71-2, really, the economic reform ideas that were floating around at the time.
Just going from sanctions onto the war, like any war, the causes are very often not as simple as one thinks. So the world just took it for granted that this was a straight racial war. But the causes are more more complex than that. Would you just like to tell us what you think?
Yeah, I don't believe it was I don't believe it can be seen adequately, comprehensively, sufficiently well in history as a black-white, simple racial conflict or war. And out of that has grown the myth that it was all internally driven. It was all the fault of the Rhodesians and a whole set of culprits, if you like, from the RF to Smith to onwards and downwards. But if you look at the history, it is true that there were fault lines in history. There was a clash of cultures in the beginning. The early pioneer settlers did not speak the languages. They were apart, and their interfaces were purely utilitarian and economic, ultimately. And some of these elements got institutionalized. And of course, there was a discriminatory structure in society that emerged out of that. And perhaps the worst feature in my mind was the 1969-70 Constitution, which founded that parliamentary representation on that racial group concept. And it was really that, an abandonment in some sense of the reformist notions that Rhodes would have, I think, endorsed and thought and expanded. But the real source of the war was external, in my opinion. And there were riots in the late 50s into the early 60s. Nkrumah had already gone to, he was the great nationalist leader of the day in ZAPU. He had gone already to Moscow. They had already sent recruits out in the late 50s and early 60s. There were houses established in Moscow, which I identify in the book, and even the street names and numbers, the involvement of the Soviets, the KGB, the GRU for training, propaganda, finance, etc., with the East Bloc satellites that were involved in the Warsaw Pact, in particular the GDR and Erich Honecker, who only supported ZAPU, except at the very end for reasons of commercial interests. Later, he started to flirt with Mugabe. Then, of course, the other side of the equation with ZANU and Zandler, they found their succor and interest out of Ghana initially, and then subsequently, of course, with the People's Republic of China. And Zandler got its bases in the PRC, Nanking, a famous one, among others. There are camps established around Africa. There was support out of North Korea, a father of Kim, for instance, who's in position today, which eventually led on to the 5th Brigade, and et cetera, et cetera. But ZANU created this ideology of nationalism. It involved a great degree of white exclusion. And out of it was a land psychosis and strategy for the future that was cooked up in the hothouses of the terrorist camps across Africa. If you look at the ZAPU, ZANU, ZIPRA, Zandler bases, not only in Africa, but in the sort of godfather countries of the PRC and its allies, and particularly also of Moscow and its East Bloc allies, there were close to 100. And in the West at the same time, there was support coming through to both those groups and their political entities, which filtrated into their armies of ZIPRA and Zandler from the Nordic countries. And most importantly of this was Sweden, but also Norway. The only exclusion there really were the Finns. They stepped aside. They did not want to get involved. And on the Western front, if you like, the Western countries, the Americans, the British, they were universally hostile to Rhodesia's existence. There was a lot of political coming and going, as you know. Whether you look at David Owen, Andrew Young, Jimmy Carter, mix of politicians and their media and the press, and so on and so forth. So I think this idea that it was internally driven, that it was the fault of just local causes belli, is palpably false and not shown by the evidence now, on which there's increasing amounts to, if you like, demonstrate the points I've been trying to articulate there about these other sources of support and bases and externalization of the war that was brought in. Now, facing this problem, the Rhodesians really were not capable to cope with the wide scope of that in the theaters of war. They attempted to do so. They fought the war in the bush for the most part. They went into external operations, as you know. There were several overlapping theaters or jocks. There were urban attacks in Salisbury on the oil tanks. There were other small dorps that were hammered occasionally, but it was rural for the largest part. And there was a widening war into Mozambique, to Zambia, Angola. And the second one was the internal war for hearts and minds in the tribal trust lands. the establishment of protected villages, of course, which began very early on in Chiweshi and then extended elsewhere. But that became very difficult to win. The PV strategy was never stellar. The attempt to get hearts and minds really for the rural folk didn't deal with their economic welfare much. In fact, in the creation of this concept, there were no economists involved that I know about. So I think they lost that economic conflict war, if you like, for welfare. And there were, of course, the sanctions wars going on in clandestine form and subterfuge. There was a diplomatic war between Rhodesia and its diplomacy, its secret links with individuals and missions and different characters in different countries, including Germany, United States, and elsewhere. But the bigger picture was on the grand chessboard, as I call it, of the Sino-Soviet conflict with the GDR and others, Romania, Yugoslavia, Mao, etc., and their support for their cat's paws in Africa, effectively, with very little Western involvement to thwart, stop, or intercede on that level. In fact, most of the Western balance of interest about Rhodesia was pretty negative or hostile for the most part. And the United Nations was aligned against it, the non-aligned movement. There was a formidable array of enemies. And notwithstanding the fact that Rhodesian intelligence was very, very good, particularly on inflows, on camps in the vicinity and things of that sort, I think the record shows that it didn't have capacities or penetration into the basis, the original sources of the conflict, the driving mechanisms in Moscow, what was then Peking and elsewhere like that, that really sat as the godfathers of the conflict right across different theaters of war. So it was worldwide in scope, and effectively at the end of the day, as you know, the Rhodesian state ended 1980, but the reality is that the Rhodesians didn't. As several books have written, Peter Godwin and Ian Hancock's Rhodesians Never Die is a very, very good one. The Rhodesians carried on, and they're still there, and you'll find them in around about 60 countries at the moment. So the war continued, the Rhodesians did as well.
Duncan, one of the points you make that got my attention was the British perception of the Rhodesians. The Rhodesians were seen as not being officer class. The Kenyans were seen as being a rung above. So we were seen as something of a lower class, but we also weren't liked by the laborites or the working class Brits who also. So we really fell between two stools in a way. The Brits appeared not to know where the hell to position us. We were somehow related, but nobody really liked us. Well, not in England.
Not a lot, no. I can have personal experience of quite a bit of that, among other people, I'm sure. The overall, the comment was made once in one of the books, which I refer, that exactly as you said, that the English view was that because it was particularly English, not just British, London dominated the interactions with Rhodesia, its history, its constitution, its support or antipathy. And they saw Kenyans as you said, officer class, a cut above. The Rhodesians were, if they were given rank at all, were NCOs in empire. Someone that once described us as Africa's little stepchildren. We were effectively, in some way, the unwanted orphan of empire. And they didn't know what to do with it. But the war was raging. It got worse. It became terminal. And, there was a negotiated end that the British stepped in at the end and, quickly stepped out again, as they do from time to time. And so there was this deep cultural antipathy. You can see it in the literature. You can see it in the journalism. It is still existent today, I could let you know. There are only a few small strands of what we could call English-British culture that have the time of day for the Rhodesian story and world. A good example of that is the hostility that arose over the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, for example, and the whole sort of upset that engendered. Now, the Rhodesians, in a sense, still live, I think, with what I've called the sins of the fathers. Rhodes was castigated for all sorts of reasons, notwithstanding his tremendous record, notwithstanding the fact that he and his cohorts at the time ended slavery on the Zambezia Plateau, not only in Ndebele, but from the Prazeros in the east, from the Portuguese side and elsewhere. And so in a way, that was the great schism of separating the history of Zambezia to create Rhodesia, which brought modernity and economic growth, secular, real economic growth over decades and decades. None of that achievement is given effectively much time of the day. And so I think there's still this hostility or antipathy, although it's fading away naturally because there are bigger problems in the world right now and have been since 1980, of course, as well. But it is a feature that you can find in the literature and on BBC, in a lot of the publishing world here and elsewhere.
You know, Duncan, I used to love hearing Ian Smith talk about it, because he said that one of the, if not the most irritating thing, a point that he made to successive British politicians was, you know, they would dangle this carrot about, you know, if you stop being badly behaved, you're going to be welcomed back into the body of the church, as it were, and you'll be back, you know, at Buckingham Palace and all the ceremonial occasions. You know, you'll be back part of the family. And Ian Smith used to explain that wasn't the priority, that, you know, the Rhodesians would like to be back in the fold, but it wasn't the end of the world. And we were actually quite happy building our own identity. We didn't actually have to be seen at all the ceremonial occasions. And that they took as a terrific affront, you know, the impertinence of these upstarts, I suppose. And who the hell were they to turn their noses up at being part of the establishment?
I think that's true. The discord and break between Rhodesia and Britain, London and Salisbury, if you like, really fermented after the end and failure of what was a period of liberal interest during Federation, when that broke up and Zambia was accorded its independence, Malawi under Banda, and Southern Rhodesia was not accepted as a colony in the British mind that could be given independence, even though in the Rhodesian mind it had been self-governing since 1923. And even prior to that, under the company state, the Rhodesians saw themselves as an autochthonous identity within Central Africa. So there was a clash of now cultures. I wouldn't call it clash of civilizations. I mean, we weren't the most civilized people everywhere, but you know, it had created its own forms, institutions, economic success, military regiments, social, political, constitutional character, and this was denied, and then had to go through what effectively ended up as really 18 years of negotiations from the time 1962, when the Federation was falling apart. Then you had the Moncton Commission and all the rest coming and going, with all sorts of politicians floating in and out, Conservative, Labour, and talks on, you know, with Wilson on Tiger and Fearless, etc. So there was never an ability of the British to accept that this state could have its own existence. And so these attitudes merely express these underlying structures, I think, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, when the conflict started, you know, and as I said, the antecedents were riots, the Z riots, as they were called, the underground cells called Janda that was set up by Nkomo, for instance, in the very early 60s, support for ZAPU and ZANU coming through from different sources outside and externally. All of this predated 1965 and UDI, all of it. And so the Rhodesians were left with little choice, really, effectively in this one. And there were several negotiations after 1965 whereby opportunities were given for a negotiated settlement. But often these were damned by other events in history, whether it was talks with the British or events with Nkomo, for instance, subsequently, with the Viscount disasters and others. So that really there was little way in which the outcome could have varied, except that at the end, through a negotiated Lancaster House settlement. That's what I think really took place in the end. And that one came with a number of flaws as well. And of course, you saw that expressed in what I call revealed preference, whereby during the war, for all sorts of different reasons, there was an outflow of Rhodesians. At independence, there was a pretty big flood. Up to 1982, there was a bit more calm, and up to 85 rather, and then there was another set of outflows. And of course, over the years, that had continued, especially when you got the 2 bouts of hyperinflation and so on and so forth. So that while in 1975, you had the apex of Rhodesian numbers, about 275,000, as per the census, etc., of which most were Rhodesian. Some were not. There were diplomats and people on business and transients and fly-by-nights and people coming and going and the rest of it. But now, today, you're probably looking at maybe 12 to 15,000 from this original culture left. So there's been an enormous drift off the Highveld, off the savannah. They came in one stream with pioneers and some of the pre-Rhodesians, and they left in 1,000 different exodus and different departures to all over the world, to 6 continents, and we reckon about 60 countries where they're found now.
A question that I'm sure you asked often, and I'm asked, and I've had many arguments or discussions about it, but it's a question that doesn't go away about the pros and cons of declaring UDI. And there are people out there who say that that was a fundamental mistake. If Smith shouldn't have declared UDI, he should have adopted a different tack. But the more I look at where we are today in the world and the way things happen, I don't know if you agree, but I actually believe that it didn't really matter what we as white Rhodesians did. We were going to be got rid of one way or the other. The world did not want any country in Africa under any sort of white government. And one way or the other, our days were numbered. It didn't really make an awful lot of difference what we did or didn't do.
Well, you'll be familiar with Macmillan's Winds of Change, which didn't go down well in South Africa. But more importantly, I think in Rhodesia's case, it were the events in the Congo that shaped the mindset about what was likely or possible if unrestrained governance took over and there was decomposition of the state that took place in the Belgian Congo at the time. Those 25,000 Belgian refugees came south. They came mostly to Salisbury, some to Bulawayo and elsewhere, and then they were flown out by Sabina. I was about 12 years old at the time. It made a big impression on people. And I think the Rhodesians started to think then, of course it was during the federal era and the end of it, about what their future was. And it was not going to be given dominion status, as had been the case for Australia and Canada. That was a hope at one point. It faded. The liberal mindset was eroding to some extent in the political sphere. There had not been success for Todd and others during that time. The RF had come in. The threats in and around the country were growing internally and externally. The Rhodesian military were engaged in Mozambique even well before 1964-5. So UDI was a choice of one sort. I'm not sure that there were many other options on that table. It could have ended up with endless negotiation, but in the outcome of those, most likely, there would have been an unlikely kind of situation emerging that would have accorded with the sustaining of the governance structure, the growth in the economy, etc., and so on. So I think, right or wrong, UDI was declared. I recall very well being at school at the time, listening to the broadcast that Smith made on, at 11 o'clock GMT on the 11th of November, etc., etc. And when it happened, we were all ecstatic and thought this was the best thing since sliced bread. little realizing at the time, given, I suppose, youth and inexperience, etc., what would follow. But my story is that this whole drama of what would follow had already been cooked in the kitchen. There was already a revolutionary program in process in the early 60s that had been in the mind of the nationalists from the late 1950s. Now, how would that have been stopped is a question that I haven't seen an answer to. So this thing gathered momentum, and also I don't think it's very helpful to indulge too much in counterfactual history. What if UDI had not been declared? What if the RF had lost that election? What if, this, what if that? We have to deal with facts as they have been in the record and as they are. And that outcome is one revealed in the storyline. The Rhodesians declared UDI. The war carried on. It didn't start then, carried on. And there were seeds of the war set up and planted well before this time that manifested in different ways and accelerated. And it became like it did toward the end, when it had to be, or was chosen by the Zimbabwe Rhodesian government. There was a railway-led coalition, if you like, of Smith and so on, and the chiefs, to go to Lancaster House and sit down with Zanla, ZANU, ZAPU, and ZIPRA. And in the wings there, the ZAPU side was Moscow. And on the other side, Mashel had a big influence on Mugabe. So this thing was a kind of a settlement of a type, which had some constitutional protections, but it didn't have, these were turned out to be very weak. And you had a new leadership come in straight out of ZANU and Zanla into government, inexperienced, with an agenda that led on to eventually, the Gukarundi, a huge genocide of the Ndebele peoples and the Kalanga, and also onto a program of what I would call indigenization, but better known as a form of corporate chimurenga, a war against white interests and assets and so on, well before the land invasions took place. And those simply overturned the whole table and crashed the economy even further down, because there was a bit of economic growth in the 90s, but this unwound very fast, very badly afterwards, as Zimbabwe's economy slipped off its skids and its share of Africa GDP fell, and has quite badly. And now you're left with a very different kind of world. The one that's built on formal employment is pretty much eroded enormously. You had a huge demographic change in the interim, and informalization, or subsistence, kitty type economy as it's called, is the one that through most people sustain their livelihoods and survival. This is very different to how it was in the Rhodesian economic times. So, I don't know if I answered your question, but I think if you look at the sweep of history here, UDI, whether or not it had been done, has led to this phenomenon we see today. There would have been ultimately an African-led government of one sort or another. I don't know if UDI had not been declared, if there had been some election, if any different leadership might have occurred. But that's, again, this counterfactual idea, which I think is unhelpful, because you're dealing with theory and hypothesis, and we can always speculate till the cows come home. It doesn't do good at all.
Duncan, I know countless what ifs, but I've always been interested in what happened at the 61 constitutional talks, where Joshua Nkomo initially indicated his acceptance. And if he'd stuck to that, then history certainly would have, I suspect history would have turned out a lot better for all of us. But somebody got him to change his mind. Do you think that was the Soviet influence?
I truly don't know, but he did change his mind. And that had dramatic history consequences as a result, obviously. Among them was the splitting of Mugabe and Sithole and others into ZANU, and again, effectively moving east to the Far East for support from PRC and elsewhere. I don't know. I mean, I'm not privy to that sort of information. There were other occasions when Nkomo came close to agreement with Smith, where there were talks. And again, the one that most notably comes to mind, and in the record is the one that fell apart just prior as a result of the downing of the Viscounts, for instance. I think probably among the RF and Smith and the government and many Rhodesians and whites at the time, the concept of a deal with Nkrumah would have been accepted somehow, would have probably had some restraints within it. He would have been a far more, I believe, legitimate and coherent leader than turned out to be Bishop Abel Muzorewa. In a sense, if something might have happened in that regard early on, possibly our histories would have been very different, potentially. But again, counterfactual history. We can't unwind the past here.
Duncan, somehow you talk about them as, you refer to them as scatterlings, and I suppose you and I are both scatterlings in a sense, but through technology, online facilities and stuff, this animal called the Rhodesians somehow managed to sort of stick around in some sort of cohesive form.
Yeah, well, you know, Hannes, the thing is that the Rhodesian state ended, kind of died, was negotiated out of the equation. Zimbabwe was a fairly quick overnight phenomenon. You know, Lancaster House, Soames' arrival, 3 months election, midnight on April 17, flags changed, anthems changed, new army walked in the stadium in Rufaro, Rhodesian military disbanded broadly in that year. RLI, I think, in around September, if I'm right, somewhere around there anyway, and others left. The exoduses began, but the Rhodesians never died. They carried on. It was a living culture. And it's been described not merely as scatterlings, it's an interesting phrase, I believe, and a pretty good one. The white tribe, except that it was never tribal, not in the African sense. It reminted itself abroad. The ones that remained, what could be called, and I've described in part as the left behind, without putting any aspersion on that, for survival, had to exist with hybrid identities. You don't hear people at home getting up and saying, I'm a Rhodesian. They say, I'm a Zimbabwean, I'm a Zimbo, I'm a white African, I'm a white Ndebele, I'm a white Shona, I'm something else. There are binary delusions involved here. And the Rhodesians continue their cultural survival abroad. They meet, they've got associations, not only in the military and sport, for schools. They have, at the moment, probably about 50 different websites that you can find and go through. Some of these are eroding, not going to survive. A very prominent one is Rhodesians Worldwide, which has been going since 1987, and Prince Quarterly, that's well read. About 1,500 copies are sent around the world to about 60 countries. And if you look at its text, which I've gone through, this is a volume of writings from different people, different sources of their past times and current circumstances, of about 4,500 pages. It's a huge kind of literature of a sort. And there are these identities. On the other hand, our generations of children are losing that identity. I don't know if it's your case, but certainly in mine, they've been moved to 4 or 5 different countries. They now live in 3 or 4, in 2 or 3 continents. They've become absorbed in different cultures. They've become deracinated, as it would be called, out of the culture of their origin. And yet there is still a long history of, this cyber Rhodesiana, the virtual Rhodesian world. And in de facto terms, even if you look at Zimbabwe now, there's a literature and a history cultivated and curated by the History Society of Zimbabwe. You hear it in music, you can see it in art, and basically, this is a culture that in time, with the decades to come, is going to erode and is going to pass. You can't say when. When will the last Rhodesian be? Well, maybe the very end of the century, possibly. Depends how you define that term. But they will continue to exist, and the cultures will carry on, but somewhere else.
Duncan, where I think you do us all a favor is by writing about the multi-talented people that the country produced. I mean, out of a very, very small population, quite incredible how many capable people in a range of different professions and pursuits the country produced, and you go into some detail about that, and that leaves me. I'm going to ask you a tricky question, but when you look at all this talent, if you think if those people had stayed put, and we'd been given a chance to get on with our lives and do what we enjoyed doing, which was making the country a better place, where do you think we'd have ended up on the sort of economic scale of things as a nation?
Well, your first point is quite right. It was a country of enormous talent that was bred locally. There were all sorts of qualities, skills, capacities in literature, in sport, in medicine, in science, in government, in a whole range of fields that Rhodesians excelled. And when they left, they also continued to excel and often did very, very well. They also left legacies. And, even prior to independence and afterwards, obviously, there were a lot of Rhodesian-generated talent that created a bedrock for Zimbabwe in its intellectual world through history and arts and economics and other fields that were at the university. And a number of universities proliferated in the country after that. The Africans were a very well-educated populace, far more so than South Africa or other parts of Africa. The economic growth record was substantial in the country. It weakened a little bit after the impacts of sanctions in 75-6 and under the big stress of the last 3 or 4 years. But in 1980, the terms of trade improved, sanctions were lifted. Rhodesia was much beloved in the world. It was very under-indebted. Aid flowed in. Mugabe and the government racked up huge debt. It wasn't long before the skids came off the economic machine. And of course, there were big transitions in government and the public service and parastatals, which undermined the sort of stability and economic growth and track record. But if the Rhodesians, let's say the 230,000 that were there at independence, had remained, and the skills and their generations afterwards, if that could have happened as well, I do believe the growth rate would have been better. The skills diffusion to others equally would have been better and better improved. There would have been much more economic savvy and knowledge about the country, whether it was in the agrarian world or in mining or manufacturing or services and so on and so forth, that could have provided more ballast and structure to Zimbabwe's economic future. Now, a lot of that left. There were huge costs involved for Zimbabwe as a consequence of that. It was a choice made at the time by that government, and it was to their net loss. It was an outflow of human capital of an enormous amount, and at net disadvantage to Zimbabwe. So that's the history there.
Duncan, just going back a bit, talking about the literary world, and you go into some detail in your book, but I'd just like you to talk a bit more about her. Unfortunately, the literary world was dominated, in a sense, by the work of Doris Lessing, who painted a very unflattering picture of her compatriots. She didn't like the Rhodesians, and she wrote in fairly uncomplimentary terms about them, and that is what caught the imagination of the world. I mean, her book sold in a big way. She got huge attention. She got a Nobel Prize for literature, but in a way, as far as the perception of the countries, particularly white Rhodesians, was concerned, she did quite a lot of, dare I say, damage by what she wrote.
Doris Lessing, interesting character in this respect. She obviously did all that you said. She was communist. She had been part of the Left Book Club. She met an East German communist, Lessing, and she abandoned her first husband, left the children, wrote The Grass is Singing, went to England, became a novel of acclaim about her life on a farm growing up. And that kind of did create an impression and an imprint, if you like. But it's not the sum total of Rhodesian literature. And paradoxically, she came back to the country in the early 90s, mid-90s, and wrote African Laughter. And there and earlier, she had become more critical. She had abandoned communism. She had abandoned and went off into a whole range of different exotica, Sufism, etc., etc. But when she came back to Zimbabwe, she noticed the authoritarianism of Mugabe, the character of the state, the skills of their farmers, Rhodesian farmers, and she turned her mind a little bit towards the end. There was more to Rhodesian literature than Doris Lessing, and I'll try to cover it. It has a 150-year track record of longevity from the very earliest to the present. It was shaped by many formative events, whether it was the Congo, the UDI, the post-UDI, the Zimbabwean era, and obviously the war. And there's, in a sense, a kind of literary war that you can trace going through all this. It also produced great authors, John Gordon Davis, Carney, Wilbur Smith had a time there, for instance, and others. There was a lot of autobiography, not only Ian Smith's, by other ministers, etc., and modern writers. Peter Godwin, I think, is a very acknowledged writer of the Rhodesian culture, Zimbabwean shift through his different books. And there are a lot of local bred journalists, cartoonists, and others. So when you look at the literature, it stands apart in Africa. It's a very literate society. It left a very literate one. But a paradox remains that there's almost no literature left in Zimbabwe. There are very few bookshops. There's very little in the way of literary press. But there are the writers that have been there, and others that left and went abroad and came back and went away again. So it's a paradox. One of the most literary cultures in Africa, still highly literate, very well educated. The African, or if you like, Zimbabwe intelligentsia has produced some enormous range of works as well. But inside the country, in terms of bookshops and access to modern literature, there's no exclusive books. There's no foils or something of that sort. And it's very hard to find the literature. So it's a great pity that this lacuna has developed there over these years subsequent to this great literary tradition that not only the Rhodesians created, but left as a legacy as well.
Duncan, I was, in a post-1980, I used to think, well, now that the world must be seeing what's happening to the country, surely attitudes are softening towards us, particularly us white Rhodesians who everybody loved to hate. And you write about an interesting development that I think it was 2005, where you write about it was after the English had won the Ashes back in Australia, and Duncan Fletcher was the coach, and so there was much excitement. But then you write about, I think, reading the Daily Mail, and there was an article, and Duncan Fletcher was getting some credit for what had happened. But then the article went on to remind the readers that he was associated with this horrible regime. And it tells me that actually the attitude towards us, certainly in England, hadn't changed much. We were still the villains of the piece, no matter how badly the successors behaved.
Yeah, Duncan Fletcher, he went to PE, was round the corner from where I lived in Belvedere. We had mutual friends, etc. He was a great cricketer, came from a great sporting family, farm origins, and he struggled to get a British passport when all the other part of the family had got one. He went to South Africa, did great achievement there in cricket, washed up in England, and of course was invited to coach the English team against the formidable Australians over the Ashes, and he won, 5 tests. And so I was in London at the time. I had a little office there for our business, and I went to have my sort of daily cappuccino hit, because my belief is that we're only 3 cappuccinos away from the end of civilization, so you need one every day. And I'm looking at the Daily Mail in the sports section, and I see a bit about the Ashes, so I know Fletcher's involved. I have a look, I read, and he says, no, unfortunately, we can't give him a knighthood. he's from the most unloved race on the planet. So I cut this out, and I kept it. And it sort of summed up, as you said, a view, maybe just that writer at the back of the sports page, whoever he was, about that old history, which was 25 years dead by now. The sins of the fathers vested upon poor old Fletch. The other guy that did this sort of thing was the famous Hollywood actor Leonardo DiCaprio. And he was the star of Danny Archer in Blood Diamond, which I'm sure most Rhodesians would have seen, because he came across as the Rhodesian, self-declared, with the accent, bar a few little mistakes, like he would say the Shona. Of course, there's no such Shona. And, you know, and this film, it was a fabulous film, did extremely well in the box office and everywhere. But the critics got onto it, and then again, they went after the Rhodesians, and they even went after poor old Leo, which there are better reasons to go after him for, because he's a bit of a climatology cult guy. And, you know, it just shows that this thing can pop up anytime, anywhere. And I guess it's old history. There's a literary war, there's a culture war. These sort of things carry on, and they're probably going to continue. I mean, you've got to live with it. But
what went wrong? Why did it all end so badly?
We ran out of cappuccino. No, it's a joke. Well, that question, you can see either explicitly treated or implicitly in a lot of the different literature written, particularly post-war, about who lost Rhodesia, so to speak, if that's the right question. You can point to early fault lines. You can say that, you know, there weren't enough adjustments, not enough cultural integration, this constitution, that adjustment, that negotiation. And there were many, many cooks in the kitchen. And a lot of culprits, if you like, have been fingered for this liability, whether it was the generals, the Joint Operational Command, the Selous Scouts, the RF, Smith, Van der Bijl, Wilford, Kissinger, Forster, Britain, the Nordics, the West, Carrington, Tongagara, etc., etc. There's a long list. I don't think any single one can be pinned down as saying that one or that event, a single event, caused this demise or end of times, etc. There are, my view, kind of, I don't have a conspiracy theory of the world or of history. I believe much more in the cock-up concept. One thing follows another. There's a tide in history. There are cascade effects and impacts. It's a chaological understanding whereby one event transmits to another and causes other phenomena to occur. And there are missed opportunities on the road. I think a bigger question now, and this is not this old historical one about who lost Rhodesia, was who lost Zimbabwe? Well, we know one of the culprits is Robert Mugabe. Maybe there were many others. But you can perhaps try and look at these two questions together, because they're kind of connected by a period of time, but quite a lot of time. It's, you know, now, what, 40 odd years since the one event took place and the other is terminated to where it is now in the Second Republic under Mnangagwa. So I'm not sure that there's any single individual or any single event that can be said to have marked only the reshaping of history from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. There were a lot of strands, a lot of coalescence of elements. And that's why I think the storyline, as I've tried to put through in the book, has to be complex, has to have a little bit of flexibility in its understanding, because these components and these strands work one with the other and sometimes get contradicted by one or the other, and eventually it comes out in the wash, and that's called the arc of history.
Duncan, just it is something that you write about, but it's a phenomenon that kind of fascinates me, and it's the Rhodesian. The Rhodesians were unique in a lot of ways, and I think they had a unique sense of humor. And what underpinned that sense of humor was generally everybody was very capable of laughing at themselves. Nobody was allowed to take themselves too seriously. That was certainly the world I grew up in. And I think it's a great way to live, being able to laugh. And I think that ability irritated a lot of our adversaries who wanted to see us cry. And it was very hard to make the Rhodesians cry. It was very easy to make them laugh.
I'd agree. There was a kind of almost cultural component to Rhodesiana during Rhodesia and subsequently. And you see it across the literature, you see it in conversation, you would see it on the sports field, you would see it in the army, no doubt. You would find it in just, normal discourse around the braai, on the farm, anywhere you like. The jokes. And they were self-deprecating on the one side. They were also aimed at others too, with the expectation always that, they weren't meant to harm, but they would be couched in the lingua franca, the lingo, the slang, often, which I have a lot of, about 12 pages on it, with about 500 key words that were very, very common and widely used. And you in those conversations about jokes and humor, you would find a lot of these words typically found. And it all depended on context, but they were very much inclined towards humor. It probably wasn't considered a great virtue to cry, I don't believe. You'd get banged up, whether it was rugby, whether it was here or there, and people just were stoic. They took it, and they would make a joke out of it often. So some of this humor, of course, was very within group type of thing.
Okay.
So not understood outside, or underappreciated, or badly appreciated, misconstrued, and seen as not very normal or acceptable in some ways. But no, it was a very strong streak in the characters of most Rhodesians that you would meet, I think, at the time, and still right today. You'll find that element of humor.
Duncan, thanks. I think we've gone over our time. Thank you. I can't recommend this book highly enough to anybody who really wants to get a better understanding of what happened in so short a space of time, in events generated by a very small number of people. I don't think there's any historical precedent for what happened in that country, and you've certainly done, I think, an excellent job of trying to explain those events and what motivated what happened.
Thanks, Ernest. I appreciate the chance to put over a few views, and I hope that others who might be interested can read up on it. There are many elements, I think, that are still question marks that deserve attention. Maybe some other historians, yourself and others, might pick up and carry it forward. But thank you very much for this opportunity again with you to speak to you and your audience. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Duncan.
Pleasure. Thank you.